Philippe, it's great to see you today.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Philippe, you're a journalist in Nigeria, and you've got a very interesting topic that you cover, which is specifically what Russian paramilitaries are doing in Africa. Could you tell us a little bit about that? In what countries they operate? How many Russians are we talking about? And what sort of tasks or assignments do they have there?
Well, the Russians are in Africa for influence, and they're also in Africa for business. And they're in quite a number of countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Russian paramilitaries are active in the Central African Republic, in Mali, now in Burkina Faso, and also in Niger. Before then, we saw them in Libya, where they tried to help a rogue Libyan general overthrow a UN recognized government. And we've seen them also carry out some disinformation activities in Madagascar and some military activities in Mozambique. But currently, as we speak, Jason, the Russians are most active in the Central African Republic and also in Mali. That's where we have seen Russian paramilitaries carry out a number of atrocities, including massacres, torture, and rapes, women and children. So they're in their hundreds. In the Central African Republic, for example, at the time there were over 2,000 Russian paramilitaries just before the war in Ukraine started. When the war began, some were pulled from the Central African Republic and sent to fight in Ukraine's Donbas region. So we're seeing in total, hundreds of Russian paramilitaries active in Africa.
So Mali is an interesting case. Just a couple of weeks ago, a story broke by the Kyiv Post that Ukrainian soldiers have been sent to Mali to help liquidate the Wagner Group soldiers there. Could you go through that a little bit? What exactly happened in Mali and what's the current state of affairs there?
So Mali is a very interesting country. They are currently under a military dictatorship. In the last 4 years, the military has been in control of government. And in the northern part of Mali, that's a current war that's going on there. Islamist groups from Al Qaeda and the Islamic State have been fighting to take control of northern Mali. And also, there is this Tuareg separatist group that is seeking to establish independence, to gain independence in northern Mali. So they've all been fighting against the government. And the current military government brought in the Russians just about 2 years ago to help fight all these armed groups. And the Russians have been assisting the Malian military in fighting these groups, but also committing grave human rights violations in northern Mali. And recently, over a month ago, the Russians went somewhere close to the border between Mali and Algeria in a town called Tinzatwen. And all of a sudden, they faced attacks by Tuareg separatists and also by Al Qaeda-backed jihadists. And dozens of Russian paramilitaries were killed in that attack. Some were captured and are currently being held by these Tuareg separatists. The Ukrainian intelligence said they supported, the local armed fighters in dealing with the Russians. And then we have seen some of these Tuareg separatists celebrate Ukraine for assisting them. What we don't know is the level at which Ukraine gave that assistance, but Ukraine has said that they assisted, the armed men in fighting the Russians. Yeah, but there's still many Russians, a number of Russian paramilitaries still being held by these Tuareg fighters.
I think a lot of people perhaps aren't aware of the very large role that Russia has throughout Africa and many other places. In the case of Africa specifically, Macron, president of France, has recently become much more aggressive in what he said about the needs of supporting Ukraine to help fight back Russia. Many have said that the reason he's had this change of heart, is specifically because Francophone Africa is being routinely disturbed by Russian mercenaries or the Wagner Group. What's going on exactly? Has Wagner Group participated directly in the overthrow of governments there, or has Moscow helped plot the overthrow of governments in Northern Africa recently?
Well, we have seen a Russian link, to some of these coups in Africa, especially in the Sahel region. For example, in Mali, just before the coup took place a couple of years back, the military officers who led this coup were in Moscow for months and only returned back to Mali to carry out this coup. So in January of 2000, we saw about three of the leaders of the coup travel to Moscow on a military training. And then they returned, sometime around, was it August? Yeah. And all of a sudden, the coup happened. And I was speaking to a number of my contacts in the Malian armed forces, and they told me that these military officers who led the coup in Mali that overthrew President Boubacar Keïta were actually in touch with some of their colleagues back at home at the time they were in Russia on training, and only for them to return to Mali, and then about a week or so after the coup happened. So you somehow can tell that there's a Russian connection to the coup in Mali. In Burkina Faso, just before the president was overthrown, the military officers who carried out this coup had approached him a month before and asked that he invited Russian paramilitaries to the country to help fight against Islamist jihadist groups that have been troubling, most parts of the country. And when the president rejected that request, a month after that, he was overthrown by these same military officers that wanted the Wagner Group to come into Burkina Faso to assist them in fighting against the jihadists. Yes, so we have seen two coups in Africa that somehow has got a Russian link. And not long after that, we saw countries like Mali, where people began to ask for the Russians to get involved. And all of a sudden, the coup happened, and the president was overthrown, and the military are currently in the government. Yeah.
In many other countries, Russian paramilitaries have been involved in not just protecting leaders or overthrowing governments, but also protecting economic activity. In the case of Venezuela, they've been tied to things like the gold industry or to the oil industry. But in other countries in Latin America, Wagner Group has also been tied to the drug cartels. Do you see that sort of behavior also in Africa?
Of course, they're doing the same thing in Africa. In the Central African Republic, for example, that's a typical example of how Russia is involved, not just politically, but also economically. Now, let me give a bit context of what's going on in the Central African Republic. In 2013, the country descended into civil war when, Christian militia groups were fighting against, Muslim groups as well. And the UN imposed an arms embargo on the country. So no one could buy arms, could bring in arms legally into the country. Now, an election was held in 2016. In that election, the current president, just Francine Touadera, was elected president. But the problem he had was that he took power, he inherited a country that only the capital, Bangui, was under government control. The rest of the country was still under the control of Muslim rebels and Christian militia groups. So he quickly ran to Russia and sought Russia's help. First, to get the UN Security Council lift the embargo on arms. And then secondly, to get Russian military instructors in the country to train the local forces and also offer protection to top government officials, particularly the president. Now, Vladimir Putin agreed, but he also made the request that the Russians were going to control the gold and diamond resources in the country, and which the president of the Central African Republic also agreed. So since 2018, we have seen Russian paramilitaries in the country protecting the president In fact, as we speak, a Russian national is the national security advisor to the president of the country. And we have Russian paramilitaries spread across the country trying to control all the gold mines and diamond mines are in the rest of the country, not in the capital. And in everywhere these gold and diamond mines are situated, the rebels and other militia groups are in control of these mines. So the Russians knew that for them to gain control of the mines, they needed to fight against the rebels and militia groups. So they started going to communities and then killing people, torturing local artisanal miners just to be able to gain control of the mines. And in many areas, they were successful at that. And in some areas, they were not. But every time the Russians seek to take control of a mine, there's always a massacre. So that's what's been happening. Yeah.
You've mentioned now a number of times that the Russian paramilitaries have often engaged in human rights abuses, something that the people here in Ukraine have also faced at the hands of the Russians. Can you talk a little bit about that? What sorts of human rights abuses have occurred recently in Africa at the hands of the Russians?
Before the Ukrainians started to face these atrocities, Africans, especially people in the Central African Republic, have lived through Russian aggression. Now, for example, in January 2022, the Russians went to a town called Aigbado in the central part of the country. It is a mining community, and they got in there, opened fire at the local people, and eventually killed about 80 civilians. And later on, they went to other mining communities and then began to slaughter men and women. And in one particular community, a number of women were stabbed on the abdomen, and then their stomach and intestines were removed. So things that are similar to what Ukrainians have seen in cities, in towns like Bucha, even in Mariupol. So these are, similar incidents that have been ongoing in Africa for a long time since the Russians came on board in 2018. People slaughtered, women raped even in front of their own families. You see children raped in front of their mothers. And that has been ongoing, for a long time. In one very, very disheartening, incident that occurred in Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic, women who had just given birth in a hospital were raped by Russian paramilitaries. They still had blood all over them. And this group of Russian, Wagner paramilitaries just showed up and then raped these women. So we have had so many incidents of abuses, of killings, of torture, of rape, even in farms. Women who go to farms, to harvest or to cultivate crops, have been raped by, Russian Wagner paramilitaries. So what is happening is really very heartbreaking. And sadly, people in Ukraine have also seen some of these things happening in that country.
Absolutely. Philip, I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
My pleasure, Jason. Thank you for having me.